Welcome, everyone. I'm John G. Kruth. I'm the Executive Director of the Rhine Research Center. I want to welcome you to our September events. We're starting off this month with Paul Smith, who's going to be discussing UFOs and remote viewing and the relationship between them, or the non-relationship between them, as the case may be. Paul has been a great presence in the field of remote viewing for many, many years. He was part of the Stargate program and eventually became the historian of the program. Paul has a PhD in philosophy, which brings in a lot of other topics rather than just the specifics of remote viewing. It also brings in so much more theoretical foundation and also provides a good context for making a foundational argument or discussion related to these topics. Paul has been, he was one of the president of IRVA, the International Remote Viewing Association, for a number of years. He's been a member of IRVA and really such a big force within that organization. And he recently joined the board of directors for the Rhine Research Center. He has a number of books, has written a number of articles as well. I could go on, but I think many of you already know Paul. And if you don't, you'll learn about him really soon. So please welcome, Paul. It's good to see you tonight.
Well, thank you, and I'm excited to be here. We're getting ready to leave for a week up in Idaho tomorrow, and so I've been frantic the last few days, and in addition to this, trying to get things ready. So if I seem a little bit harried, I'll calm down as I go, I think. So anyway, this is a topic that I find actually quite interesting. I'm going to start off by telling you I gave a version of this for Paola Harris's Boulder EXO meetings in Boulder, Colorado last November. And just to kind of refresh my memory of various things, I was driving from here in Utah, across I-70, which is one of the most gorgeous stretches of highway in the world, I think. I'm driving along and I'm listening to, I started off with a podcast of Joe Rogan and Michael Shermer, right? And part of their conversation was about the baloney of UFOs and how unlikely it is that they're there. Shermer was a little less skeptical in that than I'd expect him to be. He said, well, I mean, it's possible there might be other intelligences out there in the universe because it's so big and we haven't seen every corner of it. But, you know, he didn't believe that they were coming here or anything like that, right? So I'm listening to this skeptical discussion of UFOs. And then I turned to the audio that I captured of Hal Puthoff's. If you don't know who Hal is, I'll mention him again later, but he's quite prominent in the field. Hal Puthoff's presentation at the joint SSE IRVA conference back in 2018, in which he revealed absolutely hard evidence that UFOs are here and they are visiting us. I mean, this is stuff that the government had classified for a long time. And some of you are familiar with the Tic Tac incident. That was only one of several. And that's a very well documented UFO event. Multispectral, Hal emphasized that, you know, they had multiple different kinds of sensor systems on the ships that were involved, captured these things, captured signatures of these things, plus the visual reported by the humans that actually saw it, the pilots that chased it, all of this stuff. I mean, very hardcore evidence for it, essentially indisputable, but people have tried to dispute it anyway. And so I get done listening to that, and then I call Skip Atwater, who, again, if you don't know who he is, I'll talk about him later. He's a pretty interesting guy. And talk to Skip about some of his work in ufology, if you will. And so I had this really kind of, I don't know, drinking from the fire hose sort of experience driving across Utah and Colorado. And it really got my enthusiasm up again, you know, for this kind of thing. So anyway, I am not much of a UFO buff. In fact, I tended to stay at arm's length for a long time. In fact, I called myself a positive leaning agnostic on UFOs. You know, anyone who says that there is no other intelligent life in the universe and that they can't possibly be visiting us, that's just an insane kind of argument. It's totally irrational to make an argument like that, because essentially, even though you don't believe it, you can't prove that there is no life, intelligent life in the universe, and that they aren't visiting us. On top of that, you also, if you start doing the calculations, and there's lots of famous remarks and comments and studies about this. If you just do the math, the odds of there being other species that are intelligent in the universe is really good. So there are rejectionists here on Earth who absolutely say, nah, that's impossible. Well, it isn't impossible, and they don't know what they're talking about. But I was at the point where, I don't know. I mean, I recognize there's almost certainly intelligent life in the universe. I like to shock my late night radio audiences by telling them I belong to the only Christian denomination that believes as a matter of doctrine in intelligent life on other planets. The Mormon Church, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, one of their points of doctrine is that God created intelligent species on lots of other planets in the universe. Now, we don't know any more about it than that, but that's what Mormons believe. And they believed that for way more than a century. So, and it's just totally plausible. So, I was agnostic about them visiting me, I guess, visiting us, not me, but visiting us, I guess, even if they're clandestine visits, right? But the information that's come out through Hal Puthoff, and I was aware of the Tic Tac stuff long before it became public. He and I had some discussions with it, and I've been involved in some stuff. And so that evidence pushed me over. I'm no longer an agnostic. I'm absolutely convinced that UFOs exist, that they are extraplanetary, that they are guided by some intelligence in one form or another, that these things are very real. Now, then I go on to hasten to add that 90% of what people say about UFOs and extraterrestrials is baloney. I would even use a stronger word if I was a cussing man. But anyway, sometimes I am. But we won't go there. It's just that, most of what's out there that's said in the popular world about it is just, I am absolutely convinced it's nonsense. But there is this 5 to 10% of material about UFOs and extraterrestrials is absolutely true, in my opinion. So, remote viewing and UFOs, promises and pitfalls. I'm going to talk about the good stuff, and I'm going to talk about the bad stuff that's associated with this topic. So, first off, a riddle wrapped in a mystery inside an enigma, but perhaps there is a key. Some of you may recognize this quote. This is from Winston Churchill. He was talking about the Soviet Union. But I think it kind of applies to this remote viewing and UFO kind of a theme that we're talking about. And it applies in this way, that here you have remote viewing, which is an enigma. We don't know how it works. We don't know why it works. And we have a mystery, which is UFOs. Right? So makes perfect sense to use our enigma to explore the mystery. So, and I think there's a reason for that. The reason, of course, is that we've not been able to get to the bottom of the UFO phenomenon through our normal physical investigatory means that we have. Science has not been able to sort this out. Not got, I guess, what would be sufficient proof for anyone. We have some proof, but not sufficient proof for everyone through scientific means. But by and large, it's been sort of a hopeless attempt there. So here along comes remote viewing, and it is, a lot of people promise that remote viewing can do anything. You can uncover any secret you want. And in principle, that's probably true. In practice, though, it's practically impossible to get every secret with remote viewing, to solve every mystery with remote viewing. For reasons I won't go into, it's kind of complicated, and it would take a while to explain that. But remote viewing can find out things that our standard conventional exploratory means can't, and has actually done that in a number of cases, particularly in the intelligence world, where it has been able to find out things that our normal intelligence collection means have been unable to. So it is kind of plausible. Use remote viewing to try and find out about UFOs. And of course, the goal, if you're going to develop proof, the goal would be to use remote viewing to find out sets of facts that then could be explored in more detail and then made objective to the rest of the world to show that, oh yeah, remote viewing found it, but then we've been able to actually unfold it and demonstrate it in a acceptably scientific way. So it's a perfectly logical thing to use remote viewing as a tool to explore the UFO phenomena. But there are pitfalls, as I say. All right, so first off, now, normally when I give this talk, it's to an audience that's mostly UFO informed and is not really very well versed in remote viewing. I'm going to assume with this audience that they have a fairly decent background in remote viewing, so I'm only going to hit a couple of elements of remote viewing that directly apply to what we're particularly interested in this evening. Okay, so first off, remote viewing is the process of perceiving real impressions, concepts, and sensory data from a target that is distant in space or time, otherwise hidden or shielded in some way, even in current time, using only the powers of the mind, in other words, extrasensory perception alone. Okay, so that's going to be our working definition of remote viewing. So it is a so-called psychic experience. In the category of all things in the world, the category of psychic is the one under which remote viewing would fit. Okay. You could also think of it as non-local intuition, non-local in the sense that there seems to be no direct way of tracing the cause and effect relationship as to how remote viewing works. We don't know what makes it work. In my opinion, it is actually non-physical, consciousness-based, but even that is not to nail it down very thoroughly because we don't know what it means to be non-physical and we don't know what consciousness is. But remote viewing seems to be comfortable in that particular domain or realm. It is extrasensory perception. And I'm going to take a moment with this term because people misunderstand it all the time. They think extrasensory means another sense. So you hear people talk about the sixth sense or the seventh sense or whatever. That's not at all what extrasensory perception means. Extrasensory perception means that it's outside of your senses. So think in terms of extraterrestrial, right? An extraterrestrial is somebody that comes from outside of or off of our planet Earth. They come from elsewhere. So we're receiving these perceptions in remote viewing or in ESP in general. We're receiving these perceptions, we're forming these perceptions based on information that comes into our minds that doesn't pass through our senses. So our senses, like vision and smell and taste and touch, even though we have in a remote viewing setting the illusion of having a visual, or the perception, I guess is better, the perception of having a visual experience or a smell experience or a sound experience, our ears and our eyes and our nose and our skin are not involved in that. It bypasses those things. That's what makes it extrasensory, okay, outside of the senses or beyond the senses, if you will. It's important to remember that. This is not a sixth or seventh sense. This is something that, a perception that you get without your senses being intermediaries in the process. Okay, so the kinds of things you get in a remote viewing session, we could, the remote viewing results involve written, verbal, sketches, even make claim models of the target that may be whatever you're targeted on. So here's an example of some remote viewing results. This is one where a sketch was developed. And again, this is not just one thing. This is probably, this is the final part of a 4 or 5 page process. There are 4 or 5 pieces of paper with words and sketches and stuff, and this is the culmination of that. This was the final result, and you can see this was the actual intended target. Okay, I'm going to talk about the circumstances under which things like this are done here in a little bit. So here's one where a clay model is involved. This was an open pit copper mine, and you can see what the student in this case, what produced. It's a fair representation in clay of an open pit copper mine. Some remote viewing results are actually very detailed, and they're actually literal. They're exactly like the target, but you don't know what they actually are until you see what the target was. So if you saw these sketches individually, you wouldn't really, you might guess. For example, in the bottom one here, this was a session I did, I guessed, oh, it's like goggles or eyeglasses, kind of like that. And the upper right, I thought that was a shaving brush. But when you see the actual feedback, you realize, oh, that's what I was remote viewing. Okay. And that's because a lot of this happens in the subconscious, and your conscious awareness, your left brain, if you will, doesn't always necessarily know or understand because it's not getting the full information. And so when it tries to figure it out, it has no reference point. Okay. Some remote viewing results are both visual and verbal. You see the sketches here. This is I'm not going to make you read this, but this was the summary that the viewer wrote of what she perceived in the process. And very quickly, the idea was she had this structure that had domes, that was domed. It had multiple levels, lots of square and rectangular shapes. Colors involved things like cream color outside and gold, yellow, red, blue, gray, green. It was made of both wood and stone. There was a light shining through colored glass that she perceived. It was ornate. It contained art. It was historical. There are these two really big wooden doors in the front. And people here were wearing flowing clothing with head drapings. Her impression was it's serious, respectful, deeply felt feelings. It's a holy place of some kind. Okay. And so, in fact, it was this monastery in Bavaria, a tall monastery. Her description was very accurate, as you can see. Now, obviously, if you were a trained artist in there, you'd had a much more detailed and accurate representation. But remember, she was doing this under blinding conditions. She did not know this was what the target was. She was trusting her subconscious to give her the right information. So that kind of gives you a start and an idea how this goes. I'm going to show you a few more results later to kind of get you tuned into the UFO element. So there's a couple of aspects to remote viewing that are important to be aware of here. And that one of those, and the big one I'm going to talk about, is mental noise, because it is the big struggle of a remote viewer to try and manage the linear thinking left brain, which is always trying to guess and come up with an answer, but even when it doesn't have enough information, and the right hemisphere, which is the one that's receiving the information and not passing judgment on it. The left brain judges, the right brain just observes. And that's why oftentimes in a psychic reading, if you will, whatever, the psychic gets so much stuff wrong is because oftentimes they don't understand this idea of mental noise. And so whatever comes into their head is what they're going to verbalize. And over time and a lot of trial and error, some psychics will be able to master that, and they actually do a pretty good job. But very often they'll get off on a tangent. And that happens in remote viewing as well if you don't know what you're doing. So mental noise is this idea of analytical overlay, where your left brain is analyzing everything that comes in and then jumping to conclusions and making guesses that turn out to be wrong based on the small, not having all the information that needs to work on. Okay, there's another component to analytical overlay you got to watch out for, and that's where your imagination kicks in. Oftentimes in a remote viewing environment, particularly if you think you know what you're remote viewing, and remote viewers will sometimes guess that they know what they're remote viewing, their imagination kicks in. And in a regular environment, that usually just leads to your typical analytical overlay response. When you get into anomalies, such as a UFO event or whatever, the imagination can really wreak havoc with the information you're getting. You can add all kinds of stuff in without realizing that what you're adding is imagination, not actual information that you're receiving. And then there's the issue of telepathic overlay, and I'll talk a little bit more about this later on, but telepathic overlay is where you, the viewer, pick up on the thoughts of other viewers or the thoughts of the tasker about the target. And if those thoughts are right, then you report it, even though you didn't get it from the target, it still may be correct. If those thoughts are wrong, it could end up completely distorting your session, and you come and report stuff that actually doesn't have anything to do with the target at all. So I'll come back to telepathic overlay later. All right. Remote viewing is a learned skill. It's based on an innate ability everyone has. The research at SRI indicated, SRI was the think tank that developed this in its fullness. The research at SRI seemed to indicate that just about anybody who was willing to give it a try under the right conditions was able to remote view to some degree. Okay, but a key is that that successful remote viewing depends on you following correct principles and doing a lot of practice to develop your consistency and accuracy as a viewer. You can maybe have a really strong start as a remote viewer when you're first learning it, but if you don't keep practicing, then your performance will be uneven as you go along. Sometimes you'll be on, sometimes you'll be off, sometimes it just won't work. So following the principles and getting a lot of practice are essential to being able to really be a successful remote viewer. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the Stargate program, and I'm sure most, if not all of you, have heard of this. This, of course, was the military's remote viewing program, and I'm going to start off with an alert. It's Stargate, not Stargate. I see lots of people writing it as one word, but the actual official title is two words, Star and Gate. It has nothing to do with the TV show, which I actually really loved, has nothing to do with the movie, Stargate. Interestingly, both of those got their names after the Stargate program got its name. So remember, two words. And the Stargate program, of course, even the fictional one was DOD, but the Stargate program I'm talking about was developed and maintained under the umbrella of the Department of Defense in some of the military services, and then later with the Defense Intelligence Agency, which is the central intelligence agency for the Department of Defense. So it was through and through, except for the first 3 years, it was through and through a DOD program. And some of you may think, well, wait a minute, why do they call it the CIA Stargate program? It's because at the end of the program's lifetime, it was passed on to the CIA. The CIA, the day it took possession of the Stargate program, it terminated the Stargate program. So it never actually operated the Stargate program. It just accepted ownership and killed it on that very same day. So it's called the CIA program because the CIA was given the job of cleaning up after it, essentially, you could say. It's the one that held the CIA was given all the archives. They're the ones that did the declassification, all of that stuff. So it's come to be known as a CIA program, even though it never actually was. Okay, and you can see this is just a long list. I'm not going to go through the whole thing, but you can see the various components and the names, the code names for it throughout the period. You've got all of these, and then notice Stargate. So this started back in 75, the DOD element back in 75, ended in 95, but it was only the last 5 years where the program was actually referred to as Stargate. So that kind of hopefully will give you a little bit of a picture as to Stargate, what its genesis was. All right, so when people find out it was DOD doing this, they kind of get this kind of an image of it. Somehow you're using a crystal ball to tell you where to shoot. Of course, it wasn't like that at all. I'm going to show you some of the examples of the sorts of targets we worked, just a very small sample, and show you how some of these turned out. Okay, so the first one, I should also say that some of you have seen me do lectures before. These will look familiar to you. I tend to use these because they're such good examples. And plus, I'm lazy and I haven't gone out to find a whole bunch more. There's a ton of them out there that are just as good as these. But I think these are useful actually specifically because it shows you in what kinds of things you can do in terms of maybe what you could do with UFO stuff. So one of these is actually a space weapon I worked on. Partway through the process, I said, well, this reminds me of a MIRV. Now, people today will say, what's a MIRV? And I'll break it out. MIRV stands for Multiple Independently Targetable Reentry Vehicle. So it's a multiple warhead ballistic missile that carries a bunch of nukes that when it enters the atmosphere, the nose cone opens up and each of these smaller weapons then fan out and each of them take out a city or whatever. So you can, instead of one missile taking out one city or one military installation or whatever, you can have one missile actually take out multiple. The Soviets had one that would do 10 at a time. And so, those are pretty scary weapons. But anyway, The task was to remote view a Soviet MIRV that was being fired as a test. The Soviets were firing as a test. The remote view a Soviet MIRV as it entered the atmosphere. And so this is what I got in the process of doing the session. And you can see example of a US MIRV over here. This guy's got a little boot on, I don't know why, but these are all, each of these were, this is a 3 warhead MIRV that we had, Minutemen, one of the Minutemen, I'm not sure which one, but you can see the comparison, how they look. This was one where we actually remote viewed our own stealth aircraft program. I should say about this, by the way, again, I had no idea what the target was. I told you what it was because I found that out afterwards. But the viewer has to be blind to the process. And so I had no idea what this target was. So I produced this from a totally unwitting state until when I was done, I had a pretty good idea what I'd been targeted on. So here's another one where we were, again, blindly targeted on the US stealth aircraft program because the security managers of the stealth program wanted to know, well, if the Russians have remote viewers, how well can they remote view our stealth aircraft program? And obviously, you can't just go ask the Russians, hey, would you remote view our stealth program so we can see how well you do? That's not going to work, obviously. So we were tasked to remote view it, again, blindly, and you can see some of the results. Again, this one at the bottom is mine. This one up here is Mel's. Now, Mel Riley, I'll talk about him a little later too. Now, Mel, you notice this actually doesn't quite capture what the B2 actually looks like. But from the front view, he's nailed it. You can see from the photo, he really captured what it was looked like from the front. Mine looks interesting in that if you note that it's got this rounded feature, it's got kind of a rounded fuselage like the B2 does, but it's got a forked tail and a faceted canopy like the F-117. And the people say, well, why is that conflated? Why do you have these things all mixed up? And I figured this out because when we were tasked on this, which I later found out, we were tasked on the US stealth aircraft, phrased in singular. But the problem is there's 2 of them. And so I think what happened is my subconscious went out to the universe and said, well, where's the stealth aircraft? Well, there's 2 of them. Well, how are we going to show that? All right, we'll just put them together in one and kind of squish it all together. And so we ended up with aspects of both of them in one sketch. At least that's my working hypothesis here. Also noted that the aircraft had a low radar signature, had a special skin, bat-like wings, radar foiling devices, and so on. Now, we did these sessions in summer of 1987. And we didn't know about the stealth aircraft program because it was so compartmented that only a relatively small number of people in the US military had access to the program. And even if you had clearances, you didn't have a need to know. They weren't telling you about it. So we didn't even know this thing really existed. But then a year later, about the middle of 1988, the Air Force revealed the existence of these stealth aircraft, and we were able to get our feedback to show us what it was we had remote viewed, and it matched quite nicely, as you can see. Here's another one, a Soviet phased array radar. This is an anti-ballistic missile radar they were going to use to try and tell if we were shooting missiles at them. The whole front face of this is a radar. It's fixed emitters. It doesn't have a dish like a lot of radars do. They're fixed emitters, and they send out the radar beam in a specific direction. And you can see that the sketch of it actually is quite accurate, representing what it is, even to having these little antennas and stuff on the roof. So that kind of gives you an idea of what kinds of technical targets we were able to describe in the remote viewing program in the government. And if you think about it, these are kinds of sort of in the category of things you're going to want to perceive if you're trying to remote view an actual UFO. So we'll see where this goes. All right, so now UFOs and remote viewing get together. How did that happen? Well, I already kind of told you, didn't kind of tell you, I did tell you about, what did I tell you? I lost my thing. Oh yeah, the idea about using an enigma to explore a mystery here. And so there's a very logical sort of train of how you might get remote viewing together with the UFO question. So, but there are a number of people involved in this, and I'm going to tell you about them. So first off is Ingo Swann. He was my mentor. He was the one that actually invented remote viewing in the first place. And surprisingly, I don't know how surprising it is, but he was quite interested in the UFO question, did some work on it. He was not nearly as obsessed with it as some of the other people I'm going to talk about, but he did talk about them fairly often. He was concerned about UFO, the extraterrestrials, put it that way. It was more the extraterrestrials he's concerned about than how they got here. And he was concerned about them. And he felt like they were aware of our ESP ability and was concerned about them being maybe becoming aggressive because they were worried about our ability with it. He had a lot to say about that. I'm not going to even try and summarize it, but he was very much involved in this, and he sadly passed away in 2013. Who wrote this book, Penetration, which is in turn one of the most bizarre things you'll ever read and one of the most fascinating things you'll ever read. The first half of the book is about his own personal experiences, both with government people who are trying to uncover elements of UFOs and extraterrestrials perhaps present here on the Earth, and also with potential aliens as well. He even, in the book, describes an experience where he actually observed a UFO that was, well, he calls it blasting the surrounding terrain. Apparently he was firing energy weapons or something. That was quite a story. The second half of the book talks about anomalies on the moon. I'll talk more about that later too, but when I read the book originally, I thought, oh, this is all National Enquirer stuff. No, I don't know. And I find out there are anomalies on the moon. It's just that NASA doesn't talk about them. I mean, NASA itself has documented anomalies on the moon. They assume, of course, that all of these anomalies have naturalistic explanations, that once we actually get there, we'll figure out what's causing them and that they'll be kind of typical kinds of things. But I'm not so sure based on some other stuff that we did a little bit later that I'll relate. Okay, so the next one is, whoops, get that out of there, is Hal Puthoff. I mentioned him earlier. He was the director of the Stanford Research Institute program that began doing the remote viewing research on behalf of the CIA, and then later when DOD took over, did it for the DOD. Hal and Ingo were the ones who first got together and came to the attention of the U.S. intelligence community for an experiment they did, kind of the first ever official remote viewing experiment at SRI. It was quite successful. And yes, I did buy that tie at Roswell when we were passing through one day. I wore it in honor of Hal. This was Hal's 80th birthday party in Austin. So anyway, I knew you were going to ask about the tie. So Hal Puthoff, he was very much, and still is very much involved in trying to reverse engineer, or trying to find out the theories behind why UFOs can behave the way they do. He's actually less interested in ETs, but more interested in the technology. Ingo was more interested in the ETs and less interested in the technology. So they were perhaps a good team in that respect. So that's Hal. And then there's Pat Price. He was one of the early remote viewers, a very controversial and interesting person, worked with SRI for about 2 years, did some of the best remote viewing that was done there. But he also was interested in the ET UFO problem. And I'll talk about him more in a minute. I don't think it comes next. Well, here's a picture of, actually, this is quite a historical shot here. You have Pat Price here in the front working some kind of a device. This is Pat. And then you have Russell Targ over here conversing with Bob Monroe, Robert A. Monroe, who founded the Monroe Institute and is famous for lots of out-of-body experiences and reporting about them. So that was a fun photo to find. This was probably taken by another early remote viewer. Her name was Hella Hammond, and some of you are familiar with her. Hella was a professional photographer, and a lot of the early remote viewing photographs, particularly the higher quality ones, were ones she took. Then there's Jacques Vallée. Jacques has been around for a long time, and I like to joke that unlike Al Gore, Jacques Vallée actually did invent the internet. And that's actually semi-true. He was one of the 50 people at ARPANET who created the prototype for the internet. He's a computer scientist, very well regarded in that field, but he's also probably one of the more, let's say, trustworthy, one of the more conscientious UFO research and theorists. He is very careful not to go, or at least to acknowledge when he's speculating and acknowledge when he has the facts behind him. We ran into him in the Latin Quarter in Paris, wow, almost 10 years ago. This is my wife and my son with him in the middle. Then there's Skip Atwater, who I mentioned before. Skip, as a young lieutenant, was directed to actually create the Army's first remote viewing program. And so he was very much involved in the actual intelligence collection aspect of the program, developing the methodology that we used in terms of how it applied to intelligence, and training the viewers and managing the operational elements, the taskings that came in and all that stuff. But he had this little side interest in UFOs, and he, on some occasions, used us as his sensing equipment as remote viewers to explore some of the more interesting UFO events and UFO encounters and UFO reports, and plus some other things that were related similarly. And Skip, the thing about Skip is he was very conscientious about doing it right. There's ways to do remote viewing of UFOs correctly. There's ways to do it really badly. Skip was very good at understanding the need for proper blinding, for rigorous controls in the process, for appropriate taskings. He knew how to do all of that stuff. And so the remote viewing work that Skip did with the viewers, I find that more trustworthy than some of the others I'm going to talk about here shortly. So you'll see some more of this later on. I'll tell you more about Skip and his involvement with this later on. Okay, here is Skip. Actually, he came out to visit. We're in Hal's office space and laboratory. And I hope he's not watching. I'm blanking on this guy's name. He was at the time the president of the Monroe Institute, but he and Skip came out for a kind of a site visit with Hal and me, and we were sitting around the table having a good time. And then Hal told Skip some stories, and you can see what happened. All right, okay, that's a setup. Nothing that you could say would shock Skip like that, but he was having fun. All right, then there's also Joe McMonigle. Joe has reported some experiences with UFOs. He hasn't focused a lot in his remote viewing on that, although he's done some. He's famous for a session on Mars, which I'll talk about later as well. Famous for doing that, monitored by Skip Atwater. So one of the things I meant to say when I was on the Skip slide, but I can say it here as well. Folks probably remember Richard Hoagland making a big fuss about the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, the JPL photos of the face on the moon and the pyramids and all that stuff. We actually were given a copy, a set of these photos, I want to say late 1983 or early 1984, before they were generally known to the public. And Skip thought he would use those photos as a base to explore potential, find out what those artifacts or parent artifacts were on the face of Mars. And that's where the idea for doing the Mars session with Joe Atwater Joe McMonigle came from, was those JPL photos. Skip found, I don't know if it was the pyramids or what element on Mars, he had used that as his kind of center of focus, and then he targeted Joe on Mars and to see if he could come up with anything. And of course, famously, Joe seems to have detected an ancient race on Mars that was in the twilight of his existence. Now, who knows what to make of that until we can actually go there and look. We won't be able to get feedback, but it's still a very provocative session that they worked. And there's Joe and me back in, I don't know, 4 or 5 years ago, I think. John Alexander, many of you know John Alexander. He was the staff officer for General Burt Stubblebine back in the Army Intelligence Security Command days, roughly 1982 to, I want to say, about 1984-ish time frame. John's duty for Stubblebine was to go out and examine all the new emerging human performance science that was coming out, and that included some of the more interesting things like the Monroe Institute's hemisync process, and so on. And John always has had an interest in UFOs and extraterrestrials. And after he left INSCOM, after he was no longer a staff officer there, he went on and had some position at the Pentagon and started an informal working group with a bunch of high-level folks in the Pentagon, military officers and civilians, DoD civilians, to try and study and look into the UFO phenomenon. I never noted whether they should make that plural or singular, because it seems like it's one phenomenon made up of several phenomena, but whatever, I'll probably use those words interchangeably. So John had this working group inside the Pentagon. It was never official. It wasn't endorsed by the Department of Defense. It was sort of we're going to get together on Monday the 25th, and we're going to look into see if we can find out some or get some more enlightenment on this issue or whatever. But it went on for quite a while, and he made a lot of connections in the process of folks that were fairly high up in the Defense Department establishment. And here we are actually in Hal's lab. You'll find this kind of interesting. This was probably, I want to say 2012, 2013 maybe. Another quite prominent, actually CIA official, his wife had discovered something in her body that they thought might be some kind of alien implant, because she'd had some abduction experiences and stuff. So it had fallen out ultimately, and so they had brought it in to Hal's lab here to examine. They were using electron scanning microscope. They were using all kinds of different devices to examine it, and to show you. So the reason they brought it to Hal, I guess I should explain that too. The reason they brought it to Hal, because he had essentially become a kind of a clearinghouse for potential UFO technology, extraterrestrial technology. So people would bring things that they found or come across or discovered, and then Hal's lab would examine them, because he had it's just some amazing instrumentation there, really state-of-the-art instrumentation. So they brought these folks brought this artifact in, and of course Hal and his team would love to actually find some real alien technology. They actually have encountered some things. Hal talked about that in his 2018 talk. Metals and things that were really exotic and do not appear to have been from Earth and that kind of thing. But they're also very careful to make sure they don't come up with any false positives. And in fact, this was one of those cases. The artifact, it turned out to be, was a staple from a toothbrush that holds the brushes in the head of the toothbrush. And apparently most toothbrushes are put together that way. And it does occasionally happen that a staple will come out and it'll work its way through the sinuses and everything else and end up then coming back out again at some point. And people have no idea it's there because it's small enough, it doesn't really do anything, so maybe irritate on its way out. And they were able to certify that what these folks thought was an alien artifact, potentially an implant of some kind, was in fact a mundane thing. It was just a standard everyday thing that had just ended up in an unusual place. So people say, they may get disappointed when they hear that, oh, I wish they'd found out it was alien. But you know what? It's just as valuable to be able to discount stuff that it discount things that might be alien, so that you know what isn't, and that makes it ultimately easier to determine what is when you find it. So that's actually a valuable thing, is to be able to eliminate things as much as to include them. Okay, and then of course the infamous Ed Dames. Ed, of course, was at Fort Meade. He was there from 1986 to 1988, early 86 to late 88, just shy of 3 years. we had both trained with Ingo Swann in 1984, but he was not assigned to the military unit. Ed had been temporarily detailed to the training program that we had, and he was supposed to go back and use his remote viewing skills to assist his own home unit. Ended up not working that way, but he did training with us in 1984. And then he didn't actually get assigned to the unit until 1986, when we moved out of the Army and into the Defense Intelligence Agency. And then he spent about 3 years with us. And during that time, he was probably the most prolific tasker of alien or ET or anomaly kinds of remote viewing assignments of anybody ever in the history of the program. And it actually was a little bit frustrating, because we as remote viewers are supposed to be remote viewing the Soviets or the Chinese or the Hezbollah or narco traffickers or whatever. And we come in, and since you have to be blind as a remote viewer, since you can't know what the target is, you're essentially at the mercy of the person doing the tasking. In this case, it was Ed Dames. And Ed had this absolute fascination with ETs and UFOs. And so he would always take advantage of our having to be blind to run us on these targets every now and again, just to see what we might turn up. And we actually got really tired of that. And some of you out there are saying, wow, I'd love to do that all the time. But when you're expecting to be remote viewing a Soviet armored division or whatever, and you end up finding you're remote viewing some UFO experience or event where there may not ever be ground truth to it too, you don't even have any idea that that's what you're doing, it can be a little annoying. And in fact, he got to do it so much that it was actually probably interfering a bit with our operational work. And the commander of the unit ordered him not to do that anymore, not to task us with UFOs and stuff. And it didn't stop him. He still did it. He was just a little more sneaky about it. So the upside of it is we have all of these remote viewing sessions that involve UFO events or whatever that make interesting reading. You can't count on the results. Unlike Atwater, Dames was very sloppy in his protocol. So you might even sometimes get a little front loading to know it was a UFO thing. And on some occasions it was like that. And that just screws everything up. You can't count on that session actually producing real info, because then your left brain kicks in and starts imagining things. And so, he would also target us on things that he had no way of knowing were real. For example, several of us worked a target he had called the Galactic Federation headquarters. Well, of course, he has no way of knowing if there's a Galactic Federation. None of us knew if there was a Galactic Federation or not. So this is a totally potential empty set target. And that's in this sort of circumstance where telepathic overlay can kick in. And I think that might have been the case with a bunch of Ed's taskings. And I think a little bit later I'll talk about that, so I won't get into great detail here. I see someone's being clever. Cynthia Bledsoe wants to know, has anyone ever RV'd Santa Claus? I'm sure she knows that is a famous remote viewing joke that we played on Ed Dames. Maybe if we have time, somebody in the Q&A can bring that up again, and I'll tell you the story. All right, and then there's Lynn Buchanan. Lynn has reported a number of interesting things, controversial things, including he had some missing time, and after it was recovered, he remembered that he had been allowed to fly one of these flying saucers. He'd been abducted, and he'd gotten in a communication with the pilot of the craft and asked if, I'm not sure exactly how it goes, either the pilot asked him if he'd like to give it a spin, or Lynn asked if he could take it for a spin. Anyway, that's one of his famous stories, is that he was allowed to fly a flying saucer. He's made a bunch of other claims as well about experiences with UFOs and so on. So now these are all the kind of Stargate folks associated with Stargate in one way or another.
Hey, Paul.
Yes.
Before you move off that picture, I noticed that you and Lynn seem to be wearing the same shirt. Do you guys do that with a lot of people?
We email each other and set it up. No.
It seems that you and I, when we're at conferences, always wear the same color
We
shirts?
do, yeah. That's so that if one or the other of us does something stupid, we can blame it on the other guy.
And one more thing before we go, you were back with the picture of Hal Puthoff and Skip Atwater, and you were saying, who is that man? Well, I know why you forgot his name. His name's Paul.
Oh,
Paul
yes.
Rademacher.
That's right. Dang it.
Yes.
Thank you for reminding me.
So I'm sorry for interrupting, but I wanted to catch
That's
those two.
okay. Mystery is solved. I'm already feeling better.
Okay. Thanks, Paul.
You bet. Thanks. Okay. So these are the aftermarket folks, the folks that came around later. So first one is Courtney Brown, and he's still out there, and he's, you know, people know that I don't necessarily approve of his agendas, but personally, I like Courtney. When it comes to remote viewing, we have some differences of opinion. I jokingly say he's never met an anomaly he didn't love, but he has done a lot of work remote viewing UFOs, remote viewing anomaly, all kinds of anomaly targets, conspiracy theory stuff, all kinds of things. People aren't aware of this. Some of you may know that he got his start actually studying remote viewing with Ed Dames. He was one of Ed's earliest civilian customers back, I'm thinking it was like 1993, before the program was even declassified. Courtney went to take Ed Dames's remote viewing course. And during that course, most of the targets they did as training targets were all UFO related. Later, Courtney, not much later, Courtney published a book called Cosmic Voyage, which was all about, I won't say all about, but included communicating, using remote viewing as a communications means with aliens and UFOs and such. So he started off very early mixing the remote viewing and the UFO phenomenon together. And many of you are still familiar with the stuff he's doing now. So there's Prudence Calabrese, who Prudence was a disciple of Courtney Brown's. She, in fact, was a kind of second in command at his organization called Farsight. Developed her own training company and went off and taught a somewhat differently flavored version of remote viewing from what she learned from Courtney Brown. She was also very much into the alien question, and famously reported that she was visited regularly by an alien. She called him the gray dude, who visited her in her bathroom. He came in, like, I think through the window or something like that, and they had these long conversations. So she was very much involved in that sort of kind of level of interest in UFOs and remote viewing. And then there's currently Stephen Greer, who he's been very much into the disclosure stuff and is very much a promoter and a marketer and all that. And he also has now recently started in being involved in remote viewing. And in my opinion, his involvement in remote viewing and his mixing of remote viewing with UFOs is really not very rigorous at all. First of all, he doesn't have a very strong background in remote viewing, and yet he teaches it. You know, I don't want to diss anybody particularly, but I've not been impressed with his remote viewing program, what I've seen of it. So anyway, but he's still a fairly prominent person out there in the UFO remote viewing world. Okay, so there is your long introduction to the topic. Let's actually explore this a little bit more. So I'm going to get down in kind of the weeds of this. So first off, Pat Price. I think arguably, even though both Hal and Ingo had an interest in these questions, Pat Price was really the one that kicked it off. And what he did was, one day, I mean, I'm sure he did other things, but the interesting story was one day while he's working with Hal at Stanford Research Institute, which became SRI, he came in one morning and threw a stack of papers down on Hal's desk and said, "I've been remote viewing the universe, and I found 4 UFO bases. And they're here on the planet Earth. And they are Mount Hayes, Alaska, Mount Zeal in Australia, Mount Perdido in the Pyrenees, between France and Spain, and Mount Nyangani in Zimbabwe. And he filled Hal in on all this and left Hal with the documentation that he had that Pat had produced over. I don't know if it was all just the evening before, but over the last few days. Excuse me. So, if this works, here's Hal telling you the story.
You told the story a while back about Pat Price just kind of on his own going out and exploring the world for alien bases, for essentially UFO bases on Earth. Could you tell me that story again?
Okay, let me give a little background on Pat Price. In our CIA and DIA funded program at SRI, looking into remote viewing, Pat Price was for sure one of our best remote viewers. Now, in addition to the taskings that we would give him, which he performed very well on, occasionally he would come in and say he'd just been sort of wandering around the Earth and came up with something and he reported it to us. Just to give you an idea of how accurate that could be, it's something we know the answer to. One day he came in, it was toward the end of Nixon's first term in office as president, and he said, I was looking around and I realized there's something in Nixon's office that will actually prevent him from making it through the second term. So we dutifully reported that back to our CIA handlers. And so they went over to the Oval Office, they looked for microwave devices or toxic substances or whatever, and they didn't find anything. But of course, as we now know from history, what was in his office that kept him from getting through a second term, the device was the tape recorder, tape recording all the Watergate issues. And so that was really obviously very accurate. Interesting enough, when he told us that, we said, oh no, that means that Spyro Agnew will become president, who was then the vice president. And Nixon said, Pat Price said, nope, he goes first. So when you consider the statistical probability of coming up with those two statements that turned out to be true, it's just off the chart. So that shows how good he was. Okay, on another day, he came in and said, I was looking around the planet last night, and I found 4 UFO bases. And so I asked him where they were and took down notes and reported them back to our CIA handlers. One of the bases, he claimed, was at Mount Zeal in Australia. So it turns out that my contract monitor called me and said, well, I know the station chief in Australia. Let me call over there and see if I can verify this. So he called the CIA station chief in Australia, and without telling him why he was calling, he just simply said, I'd like to ask you some questions about that area up around Mount Zeal. And the CIA station chief immediately came back, oh, you mean where all the UFOs are always flying around? So we took that as possible confirmation that, in fact, he was right about that. And he named 3 other sites around the planet, one in Alaska, one in Africa, and one on the borderline in the Pyrenees between France and Spain. And later on, other remote viewers were blind targeted on those sites and also came up with seeming confirmation based on seeing unusual high-tech areas. So anyway, that was our introduction to UFOs through remote viewing.
So there you go, right from the horse's mouth. So these are some of the results that Pat Price produced. I'm not going to go into detail on these. I'm not even sure I understand it all, but you can get kind of a flavor for the kind of information he was producing. So this is some kind of a vessel that he reported and sketched. And this will come up later. I'll show you again later. Notice he's got this kind of long line through it. He's divided in the middle. And I'm not sure which One of these is the external side of it, the outside of it. And I'm not sure exactly what this is, except I think maybe to represent the dimensionality of it, but you get the general shape of this thing. This was a device, and he says it was located in the middle of the ship, a gimbal arrangement, so like a gyro, like a gyroscope. It's about a 10-foot globe. Says what it's made of. The whole system, it's a kind of a control unit, right? Sort of a control unit. It involves magnetic fields and so on. So he gave us some interesting descriptions about this and some interesting details. Then there's a depiction of the solar system. I don't know exactly what all this means. I have one of my students, Russell Pickering, could probably tell me in detail. He's actually studied some of this stuff pretty intensely, but again, one of his more striking illustrations from the work he had done and given to Hal Puthoff. So some time ago, I published a couple of articles in UFO magazine at the invitation of Bill Burns, and I'm going to show you some of the sessions I reported in there. So first off, the first and only official UFO remote viewing that was ever done at Fort Meade was Project 8024. So this was in 1980. It was before a goodly number of us there, long before I was there, and certainly before either Ed or Lynn were there. But the viewer on it, I think, was probably Joe McMonigle. Yes, in fact, it was Joe McMonigle. There were a couple other viewers on it as well, but I think he was the main one. And so the story was that what caused this to become tasked is that we had a spy satellite up. I think it was probably KH-11, and it was before KH-11. It was probably one of the the hard copy photo satellites. But anyway, the satellite was in orbit and it was focused on a point on the Earth. And one of the frames of the photos caught an object flying between the satellite and the surface of the Earth. And the imagery analysts could not identify it as any known aerial vehicle of any kind. It didn't match anything that the Soviets had, any of our allies, anything that we had. They were just totally unable to sort it. So somebody decided, we'll try the remote viewers on it. And so it was tasked through official channels from ITAC, the Intelligence and Threat Analysis Center in Charlottesville, Virginia, which was an Army intelligence organization. So they tasked us to do it, and the viewers were blindly targeted on it. And they reported some interesting things. One is the viewers gave an accurate description of the ITAC buildings and facilities in Charlottesville. One of the viewers described the thing as a helicopter with a funny hull shape, and another viewer, maybe one of the same viewers, described it as an object in free fall space orbit. Now, and then they did this sketch. Now, the problem here is that we don't know what the viewers were actually capturing because, of course, let me go back here, the spy satellite is an object in free fall in Earth orbit, right? So, and the sketch actually kind of dimensionally suggests the satellite. So it's possible the viewer here was actually getting the satellite and not the object. Now, the funny shaped helicopter, now that might have been the object itself, and describing the ITAC buildings, that was, of course, part of the relationship here. So it's not a surprise they might have done that, but it also wasn't helpful. So, so we don't know actually what to make of this session. It's not particularly spectacular, but there is an interesting feature. So why didn't they actually home in on the object that was intended here? Now, it's possible the tasking wasn't done right, but I don't have the actual verbatim tasking, so I don't know how they had tasked it. But it's also possible that maybe, and this is pure speculation, I want you to have to understand this is pure speculation, it's possible that it might have been a UFO and that they have screening mechanisms to throw the viewers off so they won't necessarily accurately capture the vehicle that showed up in the photograph. Who knows? Again, I'm speculating on that, but it is kind of odd that they didn't get more on this, because in other sessions, in more mainstream kind of targets, they actually got some really amazing details in many cases. Now, other times they missed altogether, but this one showed it looks like they were on, but they didn't get any decent description of what it was that they were supposed to be describing. So who knows what that was about, but it's interesting. So that was the only official one. So what about the unofficial ones? I'm going to show you some examples from Mel Riley's work. Before I do that, maybe I'm going to have to switch off this just a second. We'll stay on the screen here, but where is that? So I've actually done an inventory of all of the UFO and anomaly sessions I could find in the Stargate archives. And Mel Riley, of all of them that I could get access to that information or found, let's say, he's the one that probably was tasked the most. And I'll give you an example of some of the things he was tasked on. And most of these were by Ed Dames, of course. So he was tasked on the Viking 1 lander. Now, that's not a surprise. Other people have worked that one, and that's a legitimate target because it's a test to see how well you can remote view off planet. And it's a fixed feature. The lander is still there. And we know what it looks like. We know it's there. There's feedback possible from that. So he did the Viking 1 lander. That's not controversial. But then he was, there's one that I really couldn't figure out what it was. It's an unidentified structure, an unidentified location. That might have been one of these fishing trips that Ed Dames would send viewers on. It's possible. There's one that Ed had him do called the Midwayers. And that's, you'd have to research that. I'm not really familiar with what that is, but I know it's some kind of a cryptic, kind of anomalistic kind of a story. He worked the Mel and others worked the Higdon experience, which was a UFO abduction reported in Wyoming many, many years ago, one of the earliest ones. Some on Mars, several things targeted on Mars, a possible close encounter of the third kind event, which I will actually show you some of that one, and so on. There's a bunch of them, and there's one particularly that I will explain in more detail later, involving the Gulf of San Matias in Argentina. So tons of stuff. Here are some examples of the ones that Mel worked. So this is the first one. This is from his remote viewing of the Higdon experience. Now, in the Higdon event, what happened was this guy named Carl Higdon was hunting in Wyoming and was confronted by, I don't know, aliens and kidnapped and taken aboard their ship and flown to their planet. And then a few hours later, he comes to and he's kind of wandering around in the woods. And so everybody's, for a long time, people trying to figure out what happened to him. What really happened? Was it really aliens or was it something else? We don't know, but I guess Ed thought he'd see if Mel could provide some enlightenment. And Mel provided some sketches like this and like this, describing a being that was present in some way, and give you some idea of the kind of thing that he was producing. Now, you notice I'm not going into any detail. It's because it would take forever. These sessions were quite long. There is a mix of useful information, or I won't say useful. There's a mix of plausibly alien kind of information and a mix of noise. And so I in a 2-hour period, we can't sort all of that out. But this is to kind of give you a flavor of what it is. To let you know, I'm actually thinking of publishing a book about all of this eventually. I've got started on it, but I keep getting distracted by other things like Rhine Research Center talks, for example. So anyway, here's another one. This is an example from the session he did on a possible close encounter of the third kind event. Now, notice this is interesting that this is a perspective from the moon towards, well, in this case, the sun and the earth. one wonders how that is tied into a CE3 event. And it doesn't really explain it. This is just a perception that came out in his remote viewing session. Did indicate, though, here's the interesting thing, of course, presuming that he was blind on this, he did determine that there was some kind of extraterrestrial element involved. Here's another one, and I actually, this is one of the Mars sessions he did. Notice he's got this, which very clearly a flying saucer that spins. This is a passageway that goes dark into the back into the dark, draws this tunnel. This thing's underground. All this is on Mars, apparently. Then, of course, one of the things that we were also tasked on was Pat Price's UFO basis. And so here's some results from one of those. This was one I actually did. Mount Hayes was the target, and this was interesting. And I'm pretty sure this was one I did with Skip. So the tasking was really good on this. I was totally blind to it, had no idea it involved anything weird. And then I went and described the setting, and it was in a mountain, and you could go back inside the mountain. It was like a tunnel, and you got inside, and there was a bunch of these round things in there. And I sketched the kind of general shape and pattern of them, top and bottom. This was the side, and this was the top, not bottom, top and side. They were shielded. There was some kind of energy involved that reminded me, energies remind me of ultraviolet, but that was just an analogy. I couldn't actually describe what the energy was like. This object was like a torus for a fusion generator, except it was solid. Okay, so, and it held things. It had another AOL of a cyclotron. In fact, I say another stupid cyclotron. We would often get these atom particle accelerators and stuff as practice targets, and I'm getting into this one, and I'm saying, oh crap, this just reminds me of another atom smasher, another particle accelerator, not another one of those. So, but I acknowledge that AOL break, that was AOL. I knew that this was not what it was. This was just what it reminded me of. So, okay. Then this is a closer view of that, and then I'm going to compare it to Pat Price's sketch. And this, by the way, this sketch of Pat Price's, this was also related to Mount Hayes. So we're both getting very similar shaped objects associated with this. The interesting thing was Price did this in, what did I say? Did I get 73, 74? He did his in 73, 74. I did mine at least 10 years later. So if it was telepathic overlay, then Price I must have been getting it, because Price was dead. It died in 1975. If there's telepathic overlay, then there's something even more important afoot here, life after death and trans-death communication, I guess. But interesting, striking similarities between getting the same kind of information from the same target, yet a decade apart. This was Mel's version of Mount Hayes. You can see the tunnel. He has here, and calls it a tunnel. So he's getting the same kind of stuff I was getting. Same kind of stuff. His was not at the same time as me. I think he did his probably a year or two different. I could look up the dates. I don't remember exactly now. Well, I can tell you actually. Which one is this? This is Mount Hayes. Well, now it'll take me too long to look it up, but I can find that out later. So you get the idea. So this is the entrance, and then this is a closer up view of what the inside of it is like. There's a cavern inside. There's this glowing dome, a lot of natural rugged stone. That was the same impression I had, that the walls of this thing were very rocky. I should go back to tell you something about my perception of this thing. I'm in here and I'm finding these people, and in the process I'm thinking, well, they're people, but they're not people like I know. I don't know what kind of people these are. So I still haven't figured out there's any kind of an alien or ET involvement here, right? So there's some kind of people here, and I'm trying to perceive what it is they're experiencing, and I realize these guys are bored stiff. They're totally bored. It's like they're away from home. They're on a remote assignment. They don't want to be here. So it's just like American military personnel stationed in maybe back then in South Korea or in Turkey or something. Oh, here I am away from home. I hate this assignment. It's like they were totally not thrilled about being here, and yet they had a job to do, and they were doing that job. That was kind of an interesting and unexpected sort of an experience associated with a thing like this. Here's, I think, another view that Mel did of the Mount Hayes thing. You can see, again, kind of a get outside, it's in the mountains, he's trying to give you a larger view of it. And here's, I'm not sure this was the Hayes one. Might have been. He perceived in the process of a being of some sort. Notice he says dark, shadowy entity, features not distinct. He's playing this thing called a keyboard. So with the impression that he is observing something in the process. So Mel wasn't trying to imply that it was some kind of musical instrument. It wasn't. It was kind of he compares it to that. It's an analogy like keys and switches on an organ or whatever, but it is a device for observation apparently, because this is some kind of a screen or monitor. In his remote viewing session, he says he couldn't see either of these very clearly or distinctly, but these were as close as he could approach to getting you the details on it. And I don't know if there is a justification for comparing these two, but it is interesting. They both have these controlling devices in the ship, in one of these ships, shaped very similar. So there may be actually some overlap here that we can ferret out. I'm trying to find that chat in case people ask. I guess I'll just let, I downsized the chat screen so I can't see if anybody's saying anything. I don't know what happened to it. So I won't worry. I'll leave it up to John. Okay. Now, the another one of these bases is Mount Perdido in the Pyrenees. And this is what I was talking to Skip about when I was driving across Colorado to go over to Paola Harris's event. I had recalled that after retired, Skip had actually done a field trip to the Pyrenees to try and explore, see what he could find out about this base. And detailing more, but he never actually verified UFOs exactly. He did see something flying around the mountain that he couldn't quite make out. And it wasn't clear enough for him to state it was truly a UFO, but it was still something. And then he had some other interest. He met some people coming down the mountain that were kind of strange. And I think I was telling you about the IRVA talk he gave. You can get on the International Remote Viewing Association, IRVA.org website and go to their conference talks, and you can order that talk if you want. And I think it's only on DVD right now. Eventually they get on streaming video. So now I'm going to talk about one last project. This was Golfo San Matias. So Golfo San Matias, or the Gulf of San Matias, is on the coast of Argentina. And you can see this section of South America. This is the Gulf of San Matias. And why this was interesting is that a UFO encounter, the case was there was an Argentinian minesweeper, and this is not the minesweeper, but it was one similar to this, okay? Argentinian minesweeper was out in the Gulf of San Matias, and it was discovered drifting with no one on board. It was kind of like that old story of the Mary Celeste, I think that's the right encounter, where there was a ship steaming along, and they found it just kind of drifting in the water. It wasn't even steaming, it was drifting in the water, and somebody boarded the ship, and it was totally abandoned. There was food on the table, but there was nobody on the ship at all. No evidence of anyone. Then they never figured out what had happened. It just was abandoned for no reason. Something similar happened with this minesweeper. It was out in the Gulf of San Matias, and it was discovered adrift with nobody on board. Again, food in the galley, on the table, whatever, just drifting there. And so this was done, tasked by Skip Atwater, and Skip had several of us work it. And interestingly, there was a fair amount of correlation between how our results turned out. So, for example, the first one, let me go over here and scroll down. First one was Joe McMoneagle that he worked on it. Is this going to work? I'm not scrolling. Okay. So Joe, let me get the account here. I'm kind of going from the article I wrote. Joe described a UFO casting a cloud over and irradiating a small naval vessel. And that this cloud induced a kind of a feeling of insanity and fear in the crew, and essentially drove them overboard. They just went kind of nuts and they all jumped overboard. So that was his story. Tom McNair, who many of you are familiar with Tom, he described a strange billowy energy cloud that caused fear, and he felt like he should avoid it. And then a couple of years later, Skip worked Bill Ray and myself on this. Bill Ray was ultimately became commander of the remote viewing unit for a while, but he was a fellow trainee with me and another woman, and a woman, Charlene Schufelt, and Ed Dames with Ingo Swan. Anyway, Bill was worked on the session, and he reported that the UFO was spreading a mist, a vapor, and steam around the naval vessel and attacking it with energy that made the crew insane with fear and which left the ship empty of human life. He talked about the UFO's occupants as being cold and unpleasant. He noted that there was something important underwater near the site that had to do with spheres and a sense of being a colony. The interesting thing about the Gulf of San Mateos is there's been UFO, actually in this case, USO, right, undersea, unidentified submerged objects, USOs, for years, both before and after this event. So they'll be observe these UFO things because they fly, but they will dive into the water, and then some other time they'll emerge out of the water and fly off, at least as the reports state. So, did this ship run afoul of those? I don't know. My session actually wasn't very helpful. And the reason it wasn't very helpful is because, I'll tell you what I said, because when I did the session, I got what I thought was analytical overlay of a UFO event, and I didn't believe this was a UFO event. And so I couldn't get it. Well, the UFO event, my AOL was of a ship and a cloud, and it was just driving me nuts. I was trying to get rid of it because I didn't realize I was actually on. And so I ended the session because I couldn't get out of that AOL. Well, turned out that it matched what all the other three had said, and I'm kind of disappointed that I didn't stick with it a little bit longer. But that gives you kind of a rundown on this particularly interesting UFO incident, apparently UFO-related incident, and how remote viewers seem to agree on the data they were producing from this. Oops, get back on my other screen. Okay, so the value of remote viewing UFO targets. I'm going to get a little bit into discussing principles here. Value of remote viewing UFO targets is that you may get real information that isn't accessible through conventional surveillance means. In other words, you can get information that our standard means of gaining information just don't work. Remote viewing sometimes works when they won't. You may be able to actually add confirmation to a real UFO event. So there's an event that's reported, you run several viewers on it blind, and if you do it properly, they report the same kind of information that the actual observers at the target, at the event location report. That's as a kind of confirmation that maybe it really did happen. So it could be useful in that way. But you also may be able to discount a non-UFO event. Okay, and I actually participated in one of these back in it was 1998-99. There was an early UFO flap where an F-89 fighter plane, a Scorpion they call them, this is a photo of one, went down in, I want to say Michigan, somewhere in the Midwest there, Michigan, I'm pretty sure it was, might have been Illinois. I'm thinking the name of the pilot was a guy named Montclair, something like that. Some of you may know more about this than I remember, but I did several remote viewing sessions on this. Now, the thought was that the plane was attacked by UFO and disappeared somehow or other. And there was no eyewitness to that, but there were some interesting radar signatures and stuff like that. So I proceeded to do the remote viewing on this. And the ultimate outcome of my work, I was being tasked by Skip Atwater again, and I did not know it was a UFO thing, related thing. I didn't even, when I started, know it involved an airplane. But ultimately, the scenario I came up with is the plane had actually just crashed. It had apparently been a bird strike. It had hit a bird, and that had caused it to crash. And I think, so the data was a little vague as to exactly where it was crashed, but it seemed that maybe under a lake, which there was a lake in the vicinity. They were never able to locate the wreckage, which is one of the reasons why the thing has grown legs as far as being a UFO event. But my sessions seem to indicate that it was a more, conventional kind of a disappearance, that the plane had simply crashed and they just hadn't found the wreckage. So that can be useful too. Again, as I said before, sometimes being able to eliminate cases that don't involve UFOs or ETs or whatever can be actually helpful. And then you can focus on the ones that have a more higher probability of being an actual UFO event. So, but the problems with RVing UFOs, the ones that are actually injected by the people in the process, first one is front loading. Okay, oftentimes people will front load the remote viewer. The tasker will front load the remote viewer. The remote viewer will know it's a UFO session, and that will just screw everything up, because at that point your left brain kicks in. And as I mentioned earlier, it kicks in. Everything you know, think you know, or can guess is right in there competing with the much more subtle signal. And so you can't trust that information that you get from a session like that. You can't trust it. And yet people do it all the time. They think, oh, wow, I was remote viewing this UFO event yesterday, and this is what I got. And then they believe everything they say about that, even though it's largely, almost certainly imagination. Okay. The other one I've talked about a few times, telepathic overlay. You run into problems with telepathic overlay under two conditions. One is that one of the viewers or the tasker just have a really strong opinion about what the target is. And that's so strong that it blankets the actual signal, and the viewer that's subject to that is essentially victimized by the telepathic overlay believes they've got the target when what they've got is actually the strong beliefs of somebody else. The other is similar to that, but in the UFO case, it's particularly noteworthy. So let's say there's a UFO event, and let's say that there's a UFO event reported, but in fact, actually, no such UFO event actually occurred. Someone is just delusional, or they heard a rumor about a rumor and turned it into something, and then somebody wants to know about it, so they task a remote viewer on it. But what the tasker knows about the target is false. And so the viewer, subconscious goes out of the universe, discovers that there's nothing there, that there's no such UFO event. So looks around for the next most powerful psychic signal, discovers the beliefs, the strong beliefs of the tasker, says, oh, that must be it, and then reports back the scenario that the tasker believes, even though there was no event in actuality. They're just remote viewing, essentially picking up the telepathically picking up the thoughts of the tasker, and then they report that, and the tasker believes, oh, look, they confirmed what I thought was true about the target. Well, they did confirm what he thought was true, or she thought it was true, but they didn't confirm any truth to the actual event. So that's where telepathic overlay can be a real troublesome thing in this modality. And of course, the problem with coming up with corroboration or confirming that what you remote viewed was real. It's often the case you can remote view a UFO event that may well have happened, but there's no way to establish ground truth, because you can't actually call the UFO back and prove that, yes, I described it correctly. Okay, so those are three issues that you have in remote viewing UFOs, which is why I always take reports of remote viewings of UFO events, of anomaly events in general, I always take them with a grain of salt. I never actually accept them as being true. I accept them as maybe being true. The jury is out. There may be something useful here, but until I get confirmation, I don't necessarily trust it. I do allow a bit more trustworthiness to cases where there are various viewers. First of all, the event has got some substance to it, and various viewers report similar overlapping things. I'll show you an example of that in a minute. But generally speaking, I'm always really cautious with what people claim about remote viewing UFOs, because most of the time, the vast majority of it is, I'm convinced, is fantasy. All right. So, I forget how this fits in. So here's one issue. The target may not exist, and often there's no way to know. That's a problem with remote viewing UFO event or whatever. Maybe it doesn't. Maybe if, let's say you want somebody wants you to remote view Bigfoot. Well, maybe Bigfoot exists. Maybe Bigfoot doesn't. We don't know for sure. There's evidence, possibly, but it's all circumstantial for the most part. That's probably not a good example. Because there's at least some evidence for that. So let's think of something there isn't any evidence for it. If you remote view a target where there is no evidence that it exists, and it doesn't exist, it's essentially like dividing by zero. You can get anything in the process, and it won't be true. So, and the problem here, of course, is telepathic overlay if the tasker has a really strong opinion about it. So, and the accuracy of a UFO session is actually more vulnerable to mistakes in the process than in other remote viewing situations, because you don't have any additional information that may help you correct. You're not able to necessarily correct the process if you screw it up. It's just kind of, you're flying blind in that situation. So here are the rules for remote viewing. So if you follow these, then you're going to have a higher chance of being successful in reporting real information about a UFO event. So first off, the viewer can't be told anything about the target until the session is over. The viewer has to be blind to the target to keep the left brain out of it. And the same thing applies. People who are associated with the remote viewer before the session starts shouldn't know anything about the target either. I have a typo here. Should not know anything about the target either. That keeps them from inadvertently, non-verbally or whatever, passing on information to the viewer that doesn't come through ESP. The target data should be verifiable. Now, in a UFO case, that's often the rule that gets violated. So in straightforward, legitimate remote viewing, a target has to be at least in principle verifiable, even if you may not get feedback immediately. Feedback is important, because that's not only how we verify, but also how we learn to improve our remote viewing. These are all essential elements to remote viewing, and they're often violated in the case of exploring UFO phenomena. Okay. Another issue, the accuracy of the session is more vulnerable. I'm sorry. So, for example, front loading. Oftentimes in a remote viewing session, as I mentioned, the viewer will get front loaded, and then you've got all kinds of trouble. Which, do I explain that in this next slide? No, sorry, I hadn't realized I had these slides. I've been through this recently to review it, and I forgot I had these slides explaining this in more detail. The tasker and other non-viewers associated with the viewer viewing effort have to be very careful in order to make to be as successful, have the highest potential for success in remote viewing UFOs. Okay, you got to be even more careful with the process if you're going to do these anomaly kind of things. Assumptions can be deadly. Oftentimes people who want to do UFO sessions have these assumptions. Like, for example, I'd mentioned the Galactic Federation headquarters. That was an assumption by Ed Dames. He had no idea if there was really a Galactic Federation or not. And so that alone could have been a problem. He's having us remote viewing something that didn't even actually exist because he just assumed that it did. You have to be careful with assumptions. And this is what I was saying earlier. Unless ground truth can be obtained, you have to always treat your results as if they're tentative or speculative, never as being certain. An interesting piece of information that we may find more information that will corroborate later, or we may find more information that shows it's false later. Never treat it as absolutely sure that what you've got is true. Okay, so here's an interesting case. This is a tasking that I did. So back in the late 90s, and we did another one back in the early 2000s, Ingo Swan asked me to work with him and one other guy in doing a remote viewing project. He didn't tell me what it was. He just gave me some coordinates, and I went ahead and worked it. And I found out later they were lunar coordinates. He had targeted me on the dark side of the moon at some anomalies. No, I didn't say dark side, on the moon. I'm not sure which side it was on. Some anomalies on the moon. And I had no idea that's what the target was. But then I went and described, I pretty quick figured out I was not in Kansas anymore, because the landscape was really harsh. It didn't seem like there's any air there. I think I started to suspect I might be on the moon at a certain point. But I perceived that the surface wasn't the interesting thing, that underneath the surface was what was interesting. There was a kind of an entryway from the surface, a cavern underneath. There were things in this cavern. This was actually one that Ingo did. He was getting the same thing. Now, I have to say that Ingo was probably front-loaded, but he had this kind of tunnel. You can see the entrance of the tunnel going down into the ground, and there's a bluish light down here. He didn't finish it out down here the way I did, but there obviously has to be some kind of cavernous space down here. This was, let's see. This was also still his, and he's elaborating more on what he's perceiving, and he's actually getting a dome here of some sort, it seems. This was the final sketch of my session, where it seemed as if there was some kind of flying thing coming out of this cavernous area. And when I say flying thing, it was flying, but not in the sense that an atmosphere was necessary for it to fly. It was some sort of a space vehicle. But the weird thing about it is, it was kind of semi-sentient. That the thing I was perceiving seemed to be half living and half machine. So it was a living machine in a way. And later, when the second version of Battlestar Galactica came out, and they had their spaceships that were both life form and artifact, it's what it reminded me of. But I had this experience long before I ever saw Battlestar Galactica. So I don't know what to make of this. In fact, I don't make of any of this stuff. Again, I always take this stuff under advisement. I'm not going to tell you this is absolutely real. It could have been fantasy, but it certainly did make me think about the moon differently. Before I did this work, I would have said, that's all baloney. That's, there's, the moon is just this dead thing orbiting the Earth. After I did this work, I have to say, there may actually be something to all of this stuff. There may actually be something there. It's possible what I've got, what I remote viewed, is actually there. But I would not stake my life on it, because I know that I'm fallible when it comes to remote viewing these things, that remote viewing itself is fallible. It isn't ever 100% perfect. And you can often miss a session altogether, get things totally wrong. So I don't know, you have to form your own opinion, but I didn't show you everything in these sessions, because actually I don't have, they're probably Ingo's estate's property. I don't know. This is mine, but there were other correlations between what I produced and what these other viewers produced that were quite striking. So maybe it's telepathic overlay, although it didn't feel like that. It felt like that we were, at least I was independent of them, of what I was getting. So the correlations might have some more legitimacy. I can't say for sure. All right. So it may be that this is how we will actually relate to the aliens that we do first encounter. Maybe they're not all that much unlike us as we think. And I talked about Hal Puthoff. He's a really nice guy, very involved in UFOs and ETs. And I finally found out why he is so fascinated by this stuff. Because Hal, he's really been passionate his whole life about these kind of things. And I found out the reason that he likes aliens so much is because he is one. Yes, that's how put off. Okay. So, okay. So I have some commercials at the end of this. I don't know if that's allowed or not, John, but I guess I'll show them anyway. So if you're interested in home study, remote viewing course, you can go to remoteperception.com. And this is my website here, rviewer.com. I'll bring this back in a second. And you may find these interesting. Some of you have already read both of these books. My Reading the Enemy's Mind was my first book that I brought out. Tor Books published it. The second one, The Essential Guide to Remote Viewing, is available now on Amazon and on its own website, guide-to-remote-viewing.com. So I encourage you to look into these. I'm not making any money off of Reading the Enemy's Mind. It's in Kindle and used, and that's the only way you can get it. I haven't seen a cent from my publisher, so I'm promoting it just because I think it's a great book to read about remote viewing. The Essential Guide is meant as a kind of an introductory thing, and also informative for people who have a strong knowledge of remote viewing, but may have some holes in their knowledge. It's a broad survey of the field. So again, if you want the URLs, they are there. And okay, I'm done, John.
Paul, this is great. I mean, you covered so much information that I've never seen before. And I'm not sure how much of it had been presented publicly before, but there's a lot of great information that you covered in a lot of different areas. Thank you so much. And in fact,
I was happy to do it.
So first I wanted to mention, you already kind of answered some. There are a few questions that came up. In fact, there's a lot of questions, but I'm going to have to kind of pare them down a bit. But you did already answer the first one about where can people get more information about remote viewing.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Of course, you mentioned the different books that you've published on the topic, and there's also the IRVA website.
Yes, yeah. So irva.org. There's a lot of great stuff on there, and it's going to be updated here probably just in another few weeks. So John Stoller, awesome guy, is doing a great job on that, and it's going to be fully featured and have even more stuff than what it has now. So IRVA.org, the International Remote Viewing Association. Yeah.
Great, thank you. So I want to get through some of these other questions, and one of the questions that seemed to come up a number of times, you know, when people think of angels, they often think of, you know, this Archangel Michael and these wonderful, helpful beings. But, you know, in the Old Testament, angels were very different creatures and they were to be feared and very vengeful creatures. And as we move forward on through the, you know, 15th to 16th century, similar stories come up that seem to be similar to some of the stories of angels, but they're related to witches. And witches who capture and steal people away. And it seems that it has progressed through times to more current times where it's related to alien abductions. And they seem not so different than some of the old stories that we might have heard from other contexts. So the question is related to, and I think someone was mentioning, this might be Jacques Vallée, when he speaks about it, he often doesn't talk about extraterrestrial origin, but other potential origin that might be involved. So the question was, hey, can you discuss some other ways that these phenomena might, if they don't come from extraterrestrial, could they be some psi phenomena of some sort, or a common experience that people were interpreting in this way?
Well, yeah, I mean, and this is all speculation. Nobody. Well, let me back up. So first off, does seem to be some similarity through the centuries to these kind of stories, but they're attributed to different causes, right? Now, it doesn't mean that there aren't angels. It just means there may be something else, right? And the interesting thing about angels, of course, the word angel, the Greek and Hebrew words for angel just mean messenger, right? So even a mortal human being can be an angel in the Old Testament or even in the New Testament, right? You bring in a message from God, you're an angel, right? That's pretty much it. But there are other manifestations of angels as well, because a messenger is a function, not necessarily an ontological designator, right? So, but there are these things reported through the ages that are a certain weirder kind of a thing that match what we're hearing about alien abductions today, that match some of the witchcraft and shamanism and stuff in the Middle Ages and the Dark Ages, and match some of the things reported about angels and spirits in the, not just the Old Testament, but the surrounding literature as well, right? So what could be causing that? Well, I mean, there could be angels and witches and all that stuff, but there could also be this other feature, and it could be, we'll take the more physicalist explanation first, which is there is a certain psychological condition that humans can experience that cause them to imagine these kinds of things. And actually, they're illusion. They're not delusions. They're hallucinations. And anybody, if you know anything about mental illness at all, you know that sometimes people have hallucinations that have no external validity at all, and yet they are absolutely sure they're having that experience and they're encountering these beings or whatever. So that is plausible, and it maybe even accounts for some of this stuff, right? And then there is, of course, it's the ESP explanation, or maybe even the PK explanation, right? Where it's possible that somebody is able to project some kind of mental thing into someone else, maybe even unintentionally, that other person interprets as sort of a violation or invasion or whatever, maybe even an abduction, maybe in some way it kind of takes over their personality in some way, and then they think that they've been abducted. Again, speculation, right? Nobody knows, the bottom line here. And then there's, of course, the other end of the spectrum where people really are being abducted in some way. Now, it may just be a psychic abduction that, let's say it's an alien who has, these mental powers that are far superior to humans, and they're able to convince the person that they've been abducted, when in reality there's something else going on that serves the aliens' purposes and whatever. They never actually leave Earth. They never actually get taken to spacecraft, but they have the illusion of that happening, induced by this external, extraterrestrial force or some whatever, and then there's, of course, there's the final one, that they really are being abducted, right? And that there's just principles of physics that humans don't understand, that these aliens are able to use to instantaneously transport people or to levitate them through the air or whatever, and go to their planet and come back in 2 hours. I mean, that seems improbable, but we don't know everything. So yeah, and so we have this whole range of possibilities, and I am not even going to tell you which one I think it is, because I don't know. I have no idea. And even if you tried to remote view it, you wouldn't necessarily, you're very unlikely to produce validating information about this, because even a remote viewer could be tricked under some of these circumstances, right? So.
Well, thank you. And that was a great explanation, because it lays out some potential possibilities, but doesn't commit to any of them. Are you sure you're not a politician, Paul?
You know what? No, I'm a philosopher.
Yes.
And the fact is, philosophers don't usually commit to an explanation if they have insufficient data to explain it, to discriminate between competing hypotheses, right?
So there was a related question or comment, was that, it's possible that some of this viewing information that's coming up, it seems to be similar to each other. And could it be possible that there might be some sort of neuroscience foundation for these sort of shapes to come out in terms of this, and that maybe this is just part of the human condition? I think that's also related to the last question that we asked.
So that sounds kind of like a it sounds kind of like an alien version of a Jungian archetype or something like that, something along those lines. Yeah. There's an explanation I failed to address, and that's the possibility of a multiple. Oh, hang on, my microphone's trying to fall off. The possibility of alternate dimensions or something like that. Again, that's just speculative. We have no actual evidence for any of that, but it is. That's yet one more thing we can add to our explanatory, our proposed explanatory context, whatever, I don't know.
So I'm just going to, 2 more questions very quickly. One of them is, yeah, this is a real quick one, right? So have there ever been any viewings of alien technologies or UFO technologies that might have to do with flight or anything related to these technologies that might actually be put in use? And can you speak on this at all?
Let me say this. People have toyed with that idea for a long time, but so far I've seen nothing concrete come out of that. and I think part of the problem is with remote viewing, because there are several parts of the remote viewing process. There's the target, there's the transfer of the signal or whatever it is, there's the viewer that has to translate that, right? And it's very hard for a human being to put into words things that they don't understand. And so you could easily remote view some kind of technology, but if you don't know how to make sense of it, you're not going to be able to explain it in a way that can be useful, right? So that's one problem there. Is that the main problem? I don't know. But as far as I can tell, we've not actually been able to recreate any kind of, really detailed technology using remote viewing at all. So, maybe that's in the future. Maybe we'll accomplish that at some point. I certainly wish science had spent a lot more time researching and developing remote viewing than it does, because maybe ultimately we'll have some chance at that. Now, I did see a text thing over here I want to answer. Something about Hal Puthoff not thinking that UFOs or that aliens are hostile. That is actually not true. Hal, I'll tell you what, one time I was curious. I asked Hal, I said, okay, so I need to understand this. This is after we had some conversations about UFOs and some of the bizarre stuff that he was finding out about them. I said, so let me give you an analogy. So are ETs, are extraterrestrials more like ET in the movie ET, or they are more like the aliens in Independence Day? And he said, from what I've seen, they're more like the aliens in Independence Day. So he is very worried about these things. Now, my own belief about this is that, in a universe this big, you can't have just a stereotypical label on everything, right? So I believe it's just like here on Earth. You have people here on Earth that are hostile. You have people here on Earth that are friendly. You have people here on Earth that are kind. You have people here on Earth who are cruel. You get out in the universe with all of these ETs. Some of them are great folks. Some of them you don't want to mess with. Some of them don't care about us at all. And if it, just like ants, if they happen to step on a human, they don't even realize they stepped on a human, Some of them totally ignore us. I think we have a wide variety of different dispositions of aliens out there. And I think that probably we have a variety of them, assuming they are coming here and interacting in some way. I think there are a variety of them here too. And that to assume that all aliens are evil is a mistake. To assume that they're all friendly is a really bad mistake. Okay, you're safer assuming someone's evil and they turn out to be nice than you are to assume they're nice and they turn out to be evil, right? It's something
spoken like about. A true intelligence person. Whereas we tend to err on the side of compassion in my world. So.
Yeah, well, you saw what happened to the Incas when the conquistadors came through.
Well, Paul, so I'm just going to ask one more question because, you've been very generous with your time and I really appreciate everything. And the question is really about your Facebook group, because I know you've started a new Facebook group and it's somewhere where people can come to get more information and perhaps ask some questions that they're not getting answered tonight, because there's a lot of questions that are coming up this evening.
Yeah, it's called the Remote Viewing / Remote Perception group on Facebook. And we started because there are other remote viewing groups, but they tend to be a bit free for all, and they get into all kinds of things that aren't remote viewing. And I'm okay with that. But I think that there needed to be a home for just remote viewing. So the other groups, they get into channeling, they get into this and that, and the other thing, and astrology, whatever. There are groups for all of that stuff to discuss, but there are very few groups that are remote viewing exclusive. And so even though we have a wide tent about remote viewing in our group, it is about remote viewing. So we've set up a set of rules to try and keep the discussion focused on remote viewing and avoid the more extraneous stuff like UFOs. We talk about them, but only in a remote viewing context in our group. So remote viewing / remote perception group is what it is.
Perfect, Paul. Thank you so much.